The summer sun rose over Sarajevo on the 28th day of June 1914, casting golden light across the ancient city nestled in the valley of the Miljacka River. The streets bustled with anticipation, citizens lining the thoroughfares in their finest attire, eager to witness the arrival of royalty. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, heir presumptive to the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire, had come to Bosnia to inspect military maneuvers, to demonstrate imperial power in a land where resentment simmered beneath the surface of forced allegiance. Yet beneath the pageantry and the carefully orchestrated displays of loyalty, darker currents moved through Sarajevo's narrow streets. The city stood at the crossroads of empires and identities, a place where the aspirations of nations collided with the dreams of young revolutionaries. The empire that ruled from Vienna had annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina only 6 years earlier, a calculated move that had ignited fury among Serbian nationalists who envisioned a unified South Slavic state free from foreign domination. This was not merely a provincial capital preparing to host distinguished guests. This was a powder keg wrapped in the trappings of civilization, waiting for the spark that would consume not just one life, but tens of millions across the entire globe. Franz Ferdinand himself was a man of contradictions. At 50 years old, he carried the weight of an empire's future upon his shoulders, yet he was widely disliked within the very court he would one day rule. His marriage to Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, had been considered beneath his station, a morganatic union that barred their children from succession and ensured that Sophie would never share his imperial rank. Still, he loved her fiercely, and on this fateful day in Sarajevo, she accompanied him despite the risks that intelligence reports had whispered about. Warnings had reached Vienna in the weeks before the visit. There were rumors of plots, suggestions that nationalist elements might attempt violence against the Archduke. But pride and duty demanded that Franz Ferdinand proceed, that he show strength in the face of potential threats, that he demonstrate the empire's unshakable resolve. The motorcade assembled that morning consisted of 6 automobiles, each carrying members of the Archduke's entourage. The route had been published in newspapers days in advance, a standard practice meant to allow citizens to gather and pay respects. No one seemed to consider that this advance notice might serve another purpose entirely, that it might allow those with murderous intent to study the route, to position themselves, to prepare for an opportunity that protocol had inadvertently provided. The cars would travel along the Appelquay, running parallel to the river, before turning into the city centre, where a reception awaited at City Hall. What the Archduke and his security detail did not fully comprehend was that scattered along that published route stood 6 young men, barely more than boys, each armed with weapons and resolve forged in the crucible of nationalist fervour. They were members of Young Bosnia, a revolutionary movement inspired by visions of South Slavic unity and freedom from Austro-Hungarian rule. Behind them stood the shadowy organization known as the Black Hand, a secret society with deep connections to Serbian military intelligence. The Black Hand's reach extended from Belgrade to the border regions, its operatives providing weapons, training, and logistical support to those willing to strike at the empire's heart. Among these 6 assassins stood a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip. Born to a peasant family in the mountains of western Bosnia, he was slight of build, plagued by tuberculosis, and consumed by an ideological fire that burned far brighter than his frail body would suggest. 2 years earlier, he had attempted to join Serbian guerrilla forces fighting the Ottoman Empire, but had been rejected as too small and too weak to serve as a soldier. That rejection had not dimmed his revolutionary ardor. Instead, it had redirected his energies toward a different kind of warfare, one where a single act of violence might accomplish what armies could not. In the spring of 1914, Princip and 2 fellow conspirators, Nedeljko Chabrinović and Trifko Grabej, had traveled to Belgrade, where they received training and weapons from members of the Black Hand. They had been given pistols and bombs, along with cyanide capsules to swallow if captured, ensuring they could not betray their handlers under interrogation. The morning proceeded according to schedule. The motorcade departed from the military compound on the outskirts of Sarajevo, the open-top vehicles moving at a stately pace toward the city center. Franz Ferdinand sat in the back seat of the second car, a Graf und Stift double phaeton, with Sophie beside him. The vehicle's top was folded down, leaving them exposed to the crowd's view and unknowingly to the crosshairs of fate. In the driver's seat sat Leopold Leuchka, a 27-year-old Czech chauffeur who had been assigned to drive the Archduke during this visit. Leuchka knew the mechanics of the automobile intimately, but he was unfamiliar with Sarajevo's streets, and critically, his understanding of German, the language of the empire's elite, was imperfect at best. The motorcade proceeded along the Appel Quay as planned, passing crowds of onlookers who waved and cheered with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some genuinely welcomed the imperial visitors, while others simply fulfilled the expectations of public appearances, their true feelings hidden behind practiced smiles. At approximately 10:15 in the morning, the vehicles passed the Chumurja Bridge, approaching the position where Muhammad Mehmed Bashic, the first of the assassins, stood waiting. But Mehmed Bashic froze, unable to act when the moment arrived. The motorcade continued onward, unknowingly passing the first would-be killer who had lost his nerve. Minutes later, as the procession continued along the river, another assassin prepared to strike. Nedeljko Chabrinovich stood near the Miljacka River, his hand wrapped around a bomb concealed beneath his coat. Unlike Mehmed Bashic, Chabrinovich would not hesitate. As the Archduke's car approached, he struck the bomb's percussion cap against a lamppost to arm it, then hurled it toward the open vehicle with all the force his revolutionary conviction could muster. For a brief, terrible moment, it seemed the plot would succeed before the day had barely begun. But fate intervened in the form of trained reflexes and mechanical advantage. The Archduke's driver, Lojka, saw something flying through the air and instinctively accelerated. Franz Ferdinand himself raised his arm in a protective gesture. The bomb struck the folded fabric roof of the car, bounced off, and fell to the pavement behind them. The explosion that followed was catastrophic, but not in the way the conspirators had intended. The bomb detonated beneath the third car in the motorcade, seriously wounding Count von Buss-Waldeck and Colonel Maritzi, along with numerous spectators who had the misfortune of standing nearby. Shrapnel tore through flesh and fabric, transforming what should have been a ceremonial occasion into a scene of chaos and bloodshed. The motorcade ground to a halt. Chabrinovich, realizing that his attempt had failed to kill the Archduke, swallowed his cyanide capsule and threw himself into the Miljacka River, hoping for death before capture. But the cyanide was old and weak, merely inducing violent vomiting rather than the swift end he sought. The river itself was only inches deep in that season, and Chabrinovich was pulled from the water by police and bystanders, still alive, retching and cursing his failed martyrdom. The remaining cars in the procession regrouped. Franz Ferdinand's vehicle had sustained minor damage from shrapnel, but both he and Sophie were unharmed. The other assassins positioned along the route, rattled by the explosion and the sudden appearance of security forces, lost their nerve. Some melted into the crowd, abandoning their weapons and their mission. Vaso Chubrilovich, another conspirator, would later testify that he froze, unable to bring himself to throw his bomb when the moment came. These were not hardened killers, not professional soldiers trained in the art of political murder. They were students and dreamers, boys animated by ideology but unprepared for the visceral reality of violence and its consequences. At City Hall, where the official reception was to take place, the atmosphere was tense and strange. The mayor of Sarajevo, as protocol demanded, began to deliver his prepared speech of welcome, speaking as though nothing unusual had occurred. Franz Ferdinand, understandably furious, interrupted him with words that would be recorded for history. "I come here as your guest," he declared, his voice tight with anger, "and your people greet me with bombs." Sophie placed a calming hand on her husband's arm, and gradually the Archduke regained his composure. He delivered his own prepared remarks, going through the motions of diplomacy, even as his mind must have raced with the implications of what had just occurred. The question now facing the imperial party was what to do next. Should they abandon the visit entirely, retreat to the safety of the military garrison, and let the day's events speak for themselves? Or should they proceed with the scheduled itinerary, demonstrating that terrorism would not dictate the movements of Habsburg royalty? Franz Ferdinand made a decision that revealed both his courage and his genuine concern for those who had been injured. He insisted on visiting the wounded members of his entourage at the hospital before leaving Sarajevo. It was a humane gesture, the act of a man who felt responsibility toward those who served him. It was also, though he could not know it, a decision that would seal his fate and alter the course of human history. For security reasons, it was decided that the motorcade would take a different route to the hospital. Rather than proceeding along Franz Josef Street into the narrow lanes of Sarajevo's old bazaar district, where buildings pressed close and sightlines were limited, they would continue straight along the Apel Quay. The route was more open, easier to secure, less vulnerable to ambush. General Oskar Potiorek, the governor of Bosnia-Herzegovina, who was accompanying the Archduke, gave these instructions to the assembled drivers. But here is where the chain of small failures that would lead to catastrophe began to link together. The conversation about the route change took place in German, the language of command within the Austro-Hungarian military and aristocracy. But Leopold Lojka, the Czech driver of the Archduke's car, either did not fully understand the instructions or did not hear them clearly amid the confusion and lingering shock of the bombing attempt. Czech was his native tongue, and while he certainly knew some German, the nuances of a hastily delivered change of plans in the aftermath of an assassination attempt may have been lost in translation. Critically, no one thought to translate the new instructions into Czech to ensure that this vital link in the chain of command fully comprehended what was required. Perhaps in the heat of the moment, with nerves frayed and protocol disrupted, such considerations seemed unnecessary. Perhaps the aristocrats giving orders simply assumed that their instructions would be understood and followed without question. The motorcade set out once more, proceeding back along the Apel Quay. At the front of the procession rode the lead car, whose driver had also either not understood or not fully absorbed the new instructions. When the lead car reached Franz Josef Street, the original route, the driver turned right. Behind him, Leopold Lojka, seeing the first car turn, naturally assumed this was the correct route and followed. Franz Ferdinand's vehicle turned onto Franz Josef Street, departing from the safer path that had been intended, moving instead into the very streets the security team had sought to avoid. In the back seat, General Potiorek realized immediately that something was wrong. "What is this?" he demanded. "This is the wrong way. We're supposed to take the Apel Quay." He leaned forward, shouting at Lojka to stop, to reverse course. The driver, startled and confused, hit the brakes. The heavy automobile began to slow, its momentum carrying it forward, even as the wheels locked and skidded slightly on the cobblestones. The vehicle came to rest at the corner of Franz Josef Street and the Apel Quay, directly in front of a small general store called Moritz Schiller's Delicatessen. The location was unremarkable, a place where citizens might purchase food and sundries, where life proceeded according to the ordinary rhythms of commerce and community. But standing on the sidewalk outside that store, having abandoned hope after the earlier failed attempt, stood Gavrilo Princip. After the bombing, Princip had moved from his original position, discouraged but not yet ready to abandon the cause entirely. He had stationed himself along the original published route, perhaps hoping against hope that some opportunity might still present itself. And now, through a confluence of miscommunication, confusion, and catastrophic luck, the object of his obsessive revolutionary hatred had been delivered directly before him. Princip later testified that he could scarcely believe what he was seeing. The Archduke's car, which should have been miles away by now, speeding toward the hospital on a different route entirely, sat stationary less than 5 feet from where he stood. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were clearly visible in the open vehicle, both alive, both within range of the Browning FN Model 1910 pistol concealed in his jacket. The moments stretched and compressed simultaneously, fate offering an opportunity so improbable that even the most dedicated revolutionary might have doubted it was real. But Gavrilo Princip had come to Sarajevo to kill an archduke, and now that archduke sat before him, vulnerable and unaware. Princip stepped forward, drawing his weapon with hands that trembled not from fear, but from tuberculosis and the adrenaline that flooded his system. He raised the pistol, aimed at the open car, and fired twice in rapid succession. In that instant, the world changed. The first bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The second found Sophie, piercing her abdomen and tearing through vital organs. Both shots were lethal, placed with a precision that Princip himself would later marvel at. If I had spent my entire life studying human anatomy, historian Christopher Clark would observe a century later, I couldn't have placed those shots better than he did. The Archduke, feeling the impact but not yet comprehending its finality, turned to his wife. Blood was already darkening his military uniform, spreading in a crimson stain that grew with each beat of his failing heart. Sophie had collapsed, her head falling forward. "Sophie, Sophie, don't die," Franz Ferdinand pleaded. "Live for our children." These were his last coherent words, expressions of love that transcended rank and protocol, the desperate cry of a husband watching his beloved slip away. Then, as members of his entourage rushed to the car, as someone asked if he was in pain, the Archduke repeated softly, over and over, "It is nothing, it is nothing," even as his own life drained away. By the time they reached the governor's residence, both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were dead. Gavrilo Princip did not run. He attempted to turn the pistol on himself, to complete his mission and escape earthly judgment. But bystanders and police seized him before he could fire again. He tried to swallow his cyanide capsule, but like Chabrinovich's, it was too weak to work quickly. He was beaten by the crowd, restrained by authorities, and taken into custody. In the hours and days that followed, the conspiracy began to unravel. The other assassins were rounded up, their weapons and plans exposed, the network of support traced back toward Belgrade and the shadowy figures of the Black Hand. Under interrogation, the young conspirators revealed details of their training, their suppliers, and their motivations. They had sought to strike a blow for Serbian nationalism, to demonstrate that even the mightiest empire could be wounded by the resolve of the oppressed. They had succeeded beyond their wildest imaginings, though not in the way they might have hoped. The news of the assassination spread across Europe with the speed of telegraph wires. In Vienna, the imperial court received word of Franz Ferdinand's death with emotions far more complex than simple grief. Many in the Habsburg establishment had disliked the Archduke, had resented his reformist ideas, and had never forgiven him for marrying beneath his station. But personal feelings about the dead heir were rapidly overtaken by considerations of power, prestige, and imperial dignity. Austria-Hungary had been humiliated. One of its highest-ranking royals had been murdered on territory under imperial control by conspirators linked to a neighboring state. Such an offense could not stand unanswered. The question was not whether there would be a response, but what form that response would take and how far it might go. In the halls of power in Vienna and Budapest, in the military headquarters where generals studied maps and calculated troop strengths, in the foreign ministries where diplomats composed carefully worded dispatches, the machinery of retribution began to turn. Foreign Minister Count Leopold von Berchtold and his colleagues saw in the assassination an opportunity not merely to punish Serbia, but to resolve once and for all the question of Serbian independence and its threat to Foreignsage. Austro-Hungarian interests in the Balkans. For years, Serbia had been a source of nationalist agitation, a beacon for South Slavic peoples within the empire who dreamed of breaking away from Habsburg rule. Now, with blood on the streets of Sarajevo and an archduke dead, Vienna would have justification for actions that had previously seemed excessive or aggressive. But Austria-Hungary did not act alone in the calculations that followed. The empire turned to its powerful ally, Germany, seeking assurance that if war came, the Germans would stand beside them. Kaiser Wilhelm II, eager to support his ally and convinced that Russia would not risk war over Serbia, gave what historians would later call the blank check, a promise of unconditional German support for whatever actions Austria-Hungary deemed necessary. Emboldened by this guarantee, the Austro-Hungarian government began drafting an ultimatum to Serbia, a document so demanding and so deliberately humiliating that compliance seemed nearly impossible. Sophie, Franz Ferdinand's wife, died without ever receiving the recognition she deserved. Because of the morganatic nature of her marriage, she was never fully accepted at the imperial court, never granted the honors that should have accompanied her position as wife of the heir presumptive. Even in death, protocol diminished her. At the funeral, her coffin was placed lower than her husband's, a final insult reflecting the hierarchy that had marginalized her in life. Yet Franz Ferdinand had loved her deeply, had defied convention to marry her, had made her his partner in both the mundane and the momentous aspects of his life. That she died beside him, struck down by the same revolutionary violence, was both a tragedy and testament to their bond. The 6 young conspirators who positioned themselves along the route that June morning in Sarajevo each faced different fates. Čebrinović, who threw the bomb that wounded but did not kill, was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. He died in prison in 1916, another victim of tuberculosis that ravaged prisoners held in harsh conditions. Trifko Grabej, the third member of the core group who traveled from Belgrade with Princip, received a 20-year sentence and died in prison in 1918. Having witnessed from captivity the World War, his actions helped trigger. Vaso Čubrilović, who froze when the moment came to act, survived the war and lived until 1990, becoming an academic and politician in Yugoslavia, carrying until his death the burden of being one of the few conspirators to survive into old age and witness the full consequences of what they had attempted. The Black Hand organization that had supported the assassins was itself destroyed during the war. Colonel Dragutin Dimitrijević, the mastermind behind the conspiracy network, was arrested by the Serbian government in 1916 on fabricated charges of plotting to assassinate the Serbian regent. In reality, the Serbian civilian leadership, which had always feared and resented the Black Hand's power within the military, used the chaos of war to eliminate their domestic rivals. Dimitrijević was tried, convicted, and executed by firing squad in June 1917, taking to his grave the full details of what he knew about the assassination plot and how far his network's involvement truly extended. The Austro-Hungarian Empire did not survive the war it had helped to start. By November 1918, as the Central Powers collapsed and armistice negotiations began, the empire was disintegrating from within. Various ethnic groups declared independence, establishing new states or joining with neighboring peoples to create larger entities. Czechoslovakia emerged as an independent nation, bringing together Czechs and Slovaks who had long chafed under Habsburg rule. Yugoslavia was formed from Serbia and the South Slavic territories of the former empire, creating the unified South Slavic state that Princip and his fellow conspirators had dreamed of, though whether it matched their vision remained debatable. Hungary and Austria became separate republics, stripped of their imperial domains, reduced to small Central European states. The Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, went into exile, its legitimate claim to power dissolved by military defeat and popular rejection. The legacy of World War I extended far beyond territorial changes and political restructuring. The war transformed military technology and doctrine, introducing modern combined arms warfare that integrated infantry, artillery, armor, and air power. It accelerated medical advances, particularly in the treatment of trauma and the development of prosthetics for the hundreds of thousands of amputees the war created. It changed the role of women in society, as women filled industrial and agricultural positions vacated by men sent to the front, demonstrating capabilities that would support arguments for political equality and suffrage. It shattered cultural certainties, inspiring art, literature, and philosophy that grappled with meaninglessness, trauma, and the death of progress. The war poets of Britain, the Dada artists of Switzerland and France, the modernist writers who emerged from the war's aftermath, all sought to capture or respond to the incomprehensible horror of industrialized slaughter. Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est exposed the lie of patriotic propaganda that portrayed death in war as sweet and fitting. Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front gave voice to the disillusionment of German soldiers who survived the trenches only to find themselves unable to return to normal life. The war created a cultural rupture, a before and after that divided the confident 19th century from the anxious, modern 20th. In the Middle East, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the carving up of its territories by European powers created new nations with borders that ignored ethnic and religious realities. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, a secret arrangement between Britain and France to divide Ottoman territories, established boundaries that would generate conflicts lasting more than a century. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, promising British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, planted the seeds for decades of Arab-Israeli conflict. The mandatory system that placed former Ottoman territories under European control fostered nationalist movements that would eventually drive out the colonial powers but inherit states with fundamental instabilities. For the generation that fought in World War I and survived, the experience was transformative and traumatic in ways that subsequent generations struggled to comprehend fully. Men who had witnessed years of artillery bombardments returned home with what was then called shell shock, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had seen friends disintegrated by high-explosive shells, watched men drown in mud, witnessed poison gas attacks that left victims choking and blind. They had lived in trenches infested with rats that fed on corpses, had gone weeks without bathing, had endured cold and heat and constant fear of death. Many found they could not speak of what they had experienced, that the gap between the front lines and the home front was too vast to bridge with words. The economic consequences of the war were equally profound. The financial cost was staggering, with all the major combatant nations accumulating debts that would burden them for decades. Britain, which had been the world's leading financial power before the war, found itself deeply in debt to the United States, which emerged from the conflict as the new economic superpower. Germany, forced to pay massive reparations under the Treaty of Versailles, experienced hyperinflation in the early 1920s that destroyed savings and created conditions of economic chaos. This economic instability contributed to political extremism, creating fertile ground for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, who exploited resentment over the war's outcome to gain power. The Russian Empire, unable to sustain the strain of war with its backward economy and inefficient military, collapsed in revolution. The Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917 took Russia out of the war, but plunged it into a civil war that would last until 1921 and claim millions more lives. The establishment of the Soviet Union created a new type of state, one based on communist ideology and totalitarian control, that would rival and challenge Western capitalist democracies for the remainder of the 20th century. The ideological competition between communism and capitalism, between Soviet and American spheres of influence, would shape global politics through the Cold War and leave lasting impacts even after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. The psychological impact of the war on European civilization cannot be overstated. Before 1914, there had been widespread belief in progress, in the capacity of reason and science to solve human problems, in the essential superiority of European civilization. The war shattered these certainties. How could civilization be progressive when it had created machines for killing on such a scale? How could reason prevail when nations had stumbled into a conflict none truly wanted and none knew how to stop once it began? The optimism of the late Victorian and Edwardian eras gave way to cynicism and uncertainty. Faith in institutions, in authority, in the wisdom of leaders all eroded in the face of the war's senseless carnage. This psychological transformation had political consequences. The old order of monarchies and empires had been discredited by the war. Democratic movements gained strength, but so did extremist ideologies of both left and right. Communism promised revolutionary transformation and the destruction of the capitalist system that had led to war. Fascism offered national renewal through authoritarian leadership and rejection of liberal democracy. The fragile democratic governments established in many countries after the war found themselves under assault from both directions, struggling to address economic problems and social tensions while defending themselves from those who sought to overthrow democratic systems entirely. The League of Nations, established after the war as a forum for peaceful resolution of international disputes, represented humanity's first attempt to create a global system for preventing war. But the League was fatally flawed from its inception. The United States Senate refused to ratify American membership, leaving the organization without the participation of one of the world's most powerful nations. The League had no military force of its own and depended on member nations to enforce its decisions through collective security arrangements that often failed to materialize. When aggressive powers like Japan, Italy, and Germany began violating international norms and conquering neighbors in the 1930s, the League proved impotent to stop them. Its failure demonstrated that good intentions and diplomatic mechanisms were insufficient to prevent war without the will and capability to confront aggression. The memory of World War I influenced how nations and leaders responded to emerging crises in the 1930s. In Britain and France, the horrors of the trenches created a strong anti-war sentiment that manifested as appeasement policies toward Hitler's increasingly aggressive actions. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French leaders convinced themselves that accommodating some of Germany's demands was preferable to risking another catastrophic war. This reluctance to confront aggression early gave Hitler the time and space to rearm Germany and position it for the conquest of Europe. The lesson of World War I seemed to be that war was unspeakably horrible and must be avoided. But the lesson of World War II would be that appeasing aggressive dictators merely postponed and worsened the inevitable conflict. The technologies developed or refined during World War I found new and more terrible applications in World War II. The aircraft that had been reconnaissance tools and primitive bombers in the First War became sophisticated weapons capable of destroying entire cities in the Second. The chemical weapons used to terrible effect in World War I were not extensively employed in World War II combat, but the industrial processes for mass-producing deadly chemicals were adapted to create the gas chambers of the Holocaust. The mechanized warfare, pioneered in the First War's final year, became the Blitzkrieg doctrine that allowed German forces to conquer most of Europe with stunning speed. Each technological horror of the Second War had roots in innovations first deployed in the First. The questions raised by Franz Ferdinand's assassination and the war it triggered have never been fully resolved. How should we balance the competing claims of national self-determination and territorial integrity? When is political violence justified as resistance to oppression, and when is it terrorism that deserves only condemnation? How can diverse ethnic and religious groups coexist within common political structures, and when is separation into independent states preferable to maintaining multinational unions? These questions, debated in the aftermath of World War I, have continued to generate conflict and controversy throughout the subsequent century and into the present day. In the Balkans, where the spark was lit, the tensions that contributed to World War I never truly dissipated. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia, created after the First War to unite South Slavic peoples, was itself plagued by ethnic divisions and competing nationalisms. During World War II, Yugoslavia was invaded and partitioned, and its different ethnic groups often fought each other as viciously as they fought the occupiers. After the war, communist rule under Josip Broz Tito held Yugoslavia together through authoritarian control and a careful balancing of ethnic interests. But after Tito's death in 1980 and the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia disintegrated in the 1990s into a series of brutal wars that saw ethnic cleansing, genocide, and the return of concentration camps to European soil. Sarajevo, which had witnessed the assassination that helped trigger World War I, became once again a symbol of European conflict during the Bosnian War of 1992 to 1995. The city endured a siege lasting nearly 4 years, the longest siege of a capital city in modern warfare. Civilians were targeted by snipers and artillery, thousands were killed, and hundreds of thousands were displaced. The nationalist ideologies that had motivated Gavrilo Princip returned in different forms, justifying atrocities committed in the name of ethnic purity and historical grievances. The international community's slow and inadequate response to the Bosnian War echoed the failures of the 1930s, demonstrating that the lessons of world wars had not been fully absorbed or applied. Today, more than a century after the wrong turn that changed history, the world lives with the consequences of decisions made and paths taken in response to Franz Ferdinand's assassination. The Middle East remains unstable, grappling with borders drawn by colonial powers and conflicts rooted in the post-World War I settlement. Europe, while more peaceful and integrated than at any point in its history, still faces questions of national identity, immigration, and the balance between unity and sovereignty. The United States, which emerged from World War I as a global power, has struggled with the responsibilities and costs of maintaining international order. Russia, transformed by revolution during World War I, transitioned from Soviet superpower to post-Soviet regional power, seeking to reassert influence in its near abroad. The technologies of war have advanced far beyond what anyone in 1914 could have imagined. Nuclear weapons have created the capacity for human civilization to destroy itself entirely, raising the stakes of international conflict to unprecedented levels. Cyber warfare, drones, and autonomous weapons systems have changed the nature of combat in ways that would be unrecognizable to the soldiers who fought in World War I's trenches. Yet despite these changes, many of the fundamental dynamics that led to war in 1914 remain relevant. Alliance systems that can escalate local conflicts into global conflagrations, nationalist ideologies that prize honor over accommodation, arms races that create mutual fear and suspicion, failures of communication and empathy that prevent diplomatic solutions. The story of how a wrong turn started World War I is not simply a historical curiosity or a lesson about contingency and chance. It is a reminder that the structures we create for security can become traps, that the grievances we allow to fester can explode with devastating force, that the assumptions we make about rationality and restraint can prove catastrophically wrong. It demonstrates that history is not predetermined, that individual actions matter, but also that individual actions occur within contexts that constrain and shape their consequences. The wrong turn mattered because it occurred in a city primed for violence, on a route lined with armed conspirators, in an empire unwilling to compromise, in a Europe divided by alliances and armed for conflict. Leopold Lodge's navigation error did not make World War I inevitable, but it created the specific circumstances through which structural tensions found release. Gavrilo Princip's bullets did not cause the war, but they provided the spark that ignited accumulated tinder. The decisions made by leaders in Vienna, Berlin, St. Petersburg, Paris, and London in the weeks after the assassination were not foreordained, but they were shaped by doctrines, alliances, and domestic political pressures that made escalation far easier than restraint. Understanding how these factors combined, how a local crisis became a continental catastrophe, how 20 million people died because of decisions made in the weeks after a wrong turn in Sarajevo, is essential to understanding the 20th century and the world we inhabit today. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie lie buried in Artstetten Castle in Austria, far from the imperial capital that never fully accepted them. Their tomb is simple, marked with their names and the date of death that they share with the beginning of a new and terrible era in human history. Gavrilo Princip's remains were moved multiple times after his death, claimed by different successor states and political movements as either hero or villain, depending on the ideological needs of the moment. The Graf und Stift automobile in which the Archduke died is preserved in a museum in Vienna, an artifact of that fatal day. Its blood-stained upholstery, a silent witness to how quickly violence can transform individual lives and collective destinies. The lessons of that wrong turn, if we choose to learn them, are both humbling and urgent. They remind us that peace is fragile, that diplomacy requires patience and wisdom, that justice and security sometimes conflict in ways that demand careful balancing. They demonstrate that allowing grievances to accumulate without address creates danger, that building rigid systems of alliance can sacrifice flexibility for the illusion of strength, that preparing for war can make war more likely even when no one truly desires it. They show that communication failures, whether between a Czech driver and an Austrian general, or between nations speaking different political languages, can have consequences far beyond what anyone intends or anticipates. More than a century after that June morning in Sarajevo, we live in a world still shaped by what followed from 2 pistol shots and 20 million deaths. The borders, the nations, the alliances, the technologies, the ideologies, the memories all carry the imprint of World War I and its consequences. The wrong turn has become part of our collective inheritance, a reminder that history turns on moments, both great and small, that the decisions we make in times of crisis can echo across generations, that the price of getting things wrong can be measured in millions of lives and decades of suffering. Understanding how it happened, why it happened, and what it means remains essential not as an academic exercise, but as preparation for navigating the crises that inevitably lie ahead, for avoiding the wrong turns that still threaten to lead us toward catastrophes we cannot fully imagine but must somehow prevent. The ultimatum was delivered to Serbia on July 23, 1914, nearly 4 weeks after the assassination. The delay had been deliberate. Vienna wanted to ensure it had German backing, wanted to prepare military forces, and wanted to create conditions most favorable for the confrontation it now sought. The demands were extensive and severe. Serbia must suppress all anti-Austrian propaganda, must dissolve organizations promoting nationalist agitation, must remove from military and civil service any officers or officials that Austria-Hungary deemed complicit in the conspiracy. Most controversially, Serbia must allow Austro-Hungarian officials to enter Serbian territory to participate in the investigation and prosecution of those involved in the assassination plot. This last demand struck at the heart of Serbian sovereignty. For an independent nation to allow foreign police and prosecutors to operate within its borders, to arrest its citizens and conduct investigations without oversight, was tantamount to accepting vassal status. The Serbian government faced an impossible choice. The ultimatum included a 48-hour deadline, leaving little time for consultation or negotiation. Serbia's leaders knew that accepting all the demands would mean surrendering practical independence, becoming a client state of the empire that had long sought to dominate the Balkans. But rejecting the ultimatum would provide Vienna with the pretext for military action that the Austro-Hungarians clearly desired. Serbia's only hope lay in international support, particularly from Russia, the great Slavic power that had historically positioned itself as protector of smaller Slavic nations. Serbia's response, delivered on July 25th, was a masterwork of diplomatic maneuvering. The Serbian government accepted most of the ultimatum's demands, offering concessions that might have satisfied a power genuinely seeking justice rather than war. But on the critical point regarding Austro-Hungarian participation in the investigation within Serbian territory, Belgrade balked. Serbia offered to submit the dispute to international arbitration, to allow international tribunals to adjudicate the matter, to cooperate with investigations conducted through proper diplomatic channels. But it could not, would not, accept direct foreign intervention in its internal judicial processes without violating the very concept of sovereignty. Austria-Hungary had anticipated this response and had, in fact, carefully crafted the ultimatum to ensure that full acceptance was nearly impossible. On July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassination in Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The Austro-Hungarian ambassador in Belgrade closed his embassy and departed. Artillery batteries began their preparations, and mobilization orders went out to military districts across the empire. The localized crisis triggered by a wrong turn on a Sarajevo street was about to metastasize into something far larger, far more destructive than anyone in that fatal motorcade could have imagined. But the conflict did not remain confined to Austria, Hungary, and Serbia. The intricate network of alliances that had developed across Europe over the previous decades now activated with the mechanical inevitability of clockwork. Russia, bound by both strategic interest and cultural affinity to support fellow Slavs, began mobilizing its forces in support of Serbia. The Russian Empire could not allow Austria-Hungary to destroy Serbia without losing credibility as a great power and protector of Slavic peoples. But Russian mobilization triggered German concerns. Germany's war plans, developed over years of meticulous staff work, were based on the assumption that if war came, it would be a two-front war against both Russia and France. German military doctrine called for a massive immediate attack on France to achieve quick victory in the west before Russian mobilization could bring overwhelming numbers to bear in the east. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, on August 3rd, Germany declared war on France, implementing the long-prepared Schlieffen Plan that called for German armies to sweep through neutral Belgium before crashing into France from the north. The violation of Belgian neutrality, guaranteed by international treaty, brought Britain into the conflict. Britain had been bound by no formal alliance requiring military intervention, but it had obligations to Belgium, and more importantly, it could not allow Germany to dominate continental Europe. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany. The dominoes had fallen. What began with 2 pistol shots on a Sarajevo street corner had become a general European war. The Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, soon to be joined by the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, stood against the Allied powers, Britain, France, and Russia, eventually to be joined by dozens of other nations, including Italy, which broke its nominal alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary to join the Allies. The initial enthusiasm that greeted the war declarations, the patriotic fervor that saw young men rushing to enlist in all the combatant nations, would soon give way to the brutal reality of industrial warfare. But in those August days of 1914, few could foresee the carnage that awaited. The wrong turn that Leopold Lojka made on Franz Joseph Street became more than a navigation error. It became a symbol of how vast historical forces can hinge on small moments, how the accumulated tensions of decades can find their release through the narrowest of openings. The Balkans had been called the powder keg of Europe for years before 1914. The complex web of alliances had created a situation where any spark might ignite a general conflagration. Arms races had equipped the great powers with military machines of unprecedented size and lethality. Nationalist fervor had created populations willing to die for abstract concepts of honor and destiny. All the ingredients for catastrophe were in place. All that was needed was the catalyst. Gavrilo Princip became that catalyst, but he was no mastermind. He was a tool, shaped by forces larger than himself, wielded by conspiratorial networks that extended into the highest reaches of Serbian military intelligence. The Black Hand, officially known as Unification or Death, had been formed in 1911 by Serbian army officers dedicated to expanding Serbian territory and creating a unified South Slavic state. Its leader, Colonel Dragutin Dimitrijević, known by the codename Apis, was chief of Serbian military intelligence. The organization had already been involved in political assassinations and had established a network for smuggling weapons and operatives across borders. When Princip and his fellow conspirators sought support for their plot, the Black Hand provided training, weapons, and the infrastructure to move them from Belgrade to Sarajevo. The extent of official Serbian government knowledge of and complicity in the assassination plot remains debated by historians more than a century later. Serbian Prime Minister Nikola Pasic likely had some awareness that a plot was brewing. But the evidence suggests he made only half-hearted attempts to warn Austrian authorities or prevent the conspirators from crossing into Bosnia. Whether this was because he feared the Black Hand's power within the military, because he sympathized with the nationalist cause, or because he did not take the threat seriously enough, remains unclear. What is certain is that the links between the assassins and elements within the Serbian state gave Austria-Hungary the justification it needed, however tenuous or exaggerated, to frame the assassination as an act of Serbian state terrorism rather than the work of independent radicals. In the aftermath of his capture, Princip showed little remorse. He insisted that he had acted to free his people from oppression, that Franz Ferdinand's death was justified by the cause of Serbian nationalism. At his trial in Sarajevo, Princip was asked if he felt regret. "I am not a criminal," he responded, "for I destroyed a bad man. I thought I was right." This conviction, this absolute certainty in the righteousness of political murder, would echo through the 20th century in the ideologies of terrorism and revolutionary violence that claimed millions of lives. Princip could not be executed under Austro-Hungarian law because he was only 19 years old, 1 month short of the age at which capital punishment could be imposed. Instead, he was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, the maximum penalty allowed for a minor. He was sent to Theresienstadt fortress in northern Bohemia, a grim military prison where conditions were harsh and opportunities for medical treatment virtually non-existent. The tuberculosis that had plagued Princip for years worsened dramatically in captivity. His arm, injured during his arrest or in the beatings that followed, had to be amputated. He wasted away in his cell, his body slowly consumed by disease, even as the war he had helped ignite consumed millions of lives across Europe. Gavrilo Princip died on April 28, 1918, just months before the armistice that would end the Great War. He was 23 years old, weighing barely 80 pounds, his revolutionary fire extinguished by the slow death of disease and imprisonment. In the decades that followed, Princip's legacy became contested ground. In Yugoslavia, the multinational state created after World War I that embodied some of the South Slavic unity Princip had dreamed of, he was sometimes celebrated as a freedom fighter and national hero. Monuments were erected to him. His grave became a site of pilgrimage for those who saw him as a martyr to the cause of liberation from imperial oppression. But as Yugoslavia itself collapsed in the 1990s, torn apart by the same ethnic tensions that had simmered beneath its surface for decades, views of Princip fractured along nationalist lines. To some, he remained a hero. To others, he was a terrorist whose actions had brought catastrophe, not liberation. The debate over how to remember Gavrilo Princip continues, a reflection of how contested the histories of the Balkans remain. Leopold Lojka, the Czech chauffeur whose wrong turn had placed the Archduke in Princip's line of fire, was never officially blamed for what happened. He continued to work as a driver after the assassination, later serving in the Austro-Hungarian army during the war. But the knowledge of his role in that fateful day haunted him. He carried the weight of knowing that his navigation error, compounded by the language barrier and the confusion of that terrible morning, had contributed to the deaths of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. After the war, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved and Czechoslovakia emerged as an independent nation, Lojka returned to his homeland. He opened a small inn in Brno, trying to build a quiet life away from the shadow of history. But he spoke little of the assassination, and those who knew him said he seemed burdened by unspoken guilt. Leopold Lojka died in 1926 at the age of 39, taking with him memories of the day when a wrong turn changed everything. The question that has haunted historians ever since is whether the war was truly inevitable or whether different choices at key moments might have prevented the catastrophe. If the wrong turn had not occurred, if Lojka had understood the instructions and continued along the Appel Quay, would Franz Ferdinand have survived the day? Almost certainly. The other assassins had already lost their nerve or failed in their attempts. By the time the Archduke would have reached the hospital via the alternate route, the immediate danger would have passed. But would that have prevented the war? This is where historical analysis becomes more complex and more uncertain. The tensions that exploded in 1914 had been building for decades. The decline of the Ottoman Empire had created a power vacuum in the Balkans, with Austria, Hungary, Russia, and emerging nationalist movements all competing for influence and territory. The unification of Germany in 1871 had upset the balance of power in Central Europe, creating a militaristic state with vast industrial capacity and imperial ambitions. The alliance system had divided Europe into two armed camps, each viewing the other with suspicion and preparing for eventual conflict. Colonial rivalries had spread European tensions across the globe, creating flashpoints in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Arms races, particularly the naval competition between Britain and Germany, had created enormous military establishments that generated their own momentum toward war. Nationalist ideologies had convinced populations across Europe that their nation's honor and destiny required military glory and territorial expansion. In this context, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand was perhaps less a cause of World War I than a trigger, the proximate event that released forces already straining for expression. If Princip had failed, if Franz Ferdinand had lived, some other crisis would likely have emerged to ignite the powder keg. Perhaps a colonial dispute would have escalated. Perhaps a naval incident would have triggered British-German hostilities. Perhaps another Balkans crisis would have created the conditions for Austro-Russian conflict. The structural factors pushing Europe toward war were so powerful, the commitments of the alliance system so rigid, the military doctrines so offensive-minded and rigid in their timetables, that avoiding a general European war by 1914 may have been nearly impossible. Yet, the specific circumstances of how the war began matter enormously for understanding what followed. Because the war started with an act of terrorism against the heir to an imperial throne, it began with questions of honor, prestige, and the acceptability of political violence. Because it began in the Balkans, it immediately involved questions of nationalism and self-determination that would shape the war's ideological dimensions and its aftermath. Because it began with ultimatums and rigid timetables rather than careful diplomacy, it escalated with a speed that left little room for the negotiations and compromises that might have contained the crisis. The wrong turn in Sarajevo did not make the war inevitable, but it shaped the conditions under which the war began and thus influenced everything that followed. The Great War that ensued would last 4 years and claim approximately 20 million lives, military and civilian combined. It would destroy 4 empires: the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, the German, and the Ottoman. It would redraw the map of Europe and the Middle East, creating new nations and new resentments that would fester for decades. It would introduce the world to mechanized slaughter on an industrial scale. Machine guns that could cut down waves of advancing infantry, artillery that could pulverize landscapes and bury men alive, poison gas that choked and blinded, tanks and aircraft that brought new dimensions to warfare. It would shatter the optimism and confidence of European civilization, creating a lost generation that had seen horrors beyond description and emerged psychologically scarred. The war's conclusion would plant the seeds for an even greater catastrophe. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh terms on defeated Germany that would foster resentment and economic instability. The collapse of empires would create power vacuums and disputed territories across Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, itself a consequence of the war's pressures, would establish the Soviet Union and begin the ideological competition between communism and capitalism that would define much of the 20th century. The failure to create a stable post-war order, the inability of the League of Nations to prevent aggression, the lingering questions of national grievances and territorial disputes would all contribute to the outbreak of World War II just 20 years after the First War's end. Thus the wrong turn on Franz Joseph Street, the miscommunication between a Czech driver and an Austrian general, the 2 shots fired by a tubercular teenager from a Sarajevo sidewalk, became not merely the spark that ignited World War I, but part of a cascade of consequences that shaped the entire 20th century. The deaths of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie in that open car outside Moritz Schiller's Delicatessen represented one of history's great inflection points, a moment when the trajectory of human events shifted dramatically and irrevocably. Standing in contemporary Sarajevo, one can visit the exact spot where the assassination occurred. A small museum occupies the building where Princip stood, displaying photographs, documents, and artifacts from that fateful day. The Latin Bridge still spans the Miljacka River, its stone arches unchanged, though everything around it has transformed. The city itself has endured yet more tragedy, surviving the siege and ethnic cleansing of the 1990s that once again made Sarajevo synonymous with violence and suffering. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand is remembered, commemorated, debated, its significance continually reassessed, as each generation looks back trying to understand how the modern world was forged in fire and blood. History does not offer simple lessons or clear counterfactuals. We cannot know with certainty what would have happened if Leopold Lodžka had not turned onto Franz Josef Street, if Gavrilo Princip had been standing somewhere else, if the pistol had jammed or the bullets had missed. We can only observe that in a world of enormous tensions and multiple potential paths, one particular sequence of events occurred and led to specific consequences. The assassination was not inevitable. The war, given the structural conditions of Europe in 1914, was far more likely, though perhaps not absolutely certain. What is certain is that the confluence of long-term structural factors and immediate contingent events combined on June 28, 1914, to produce a catastrophe that killed millions and transformed civilization. The story of how a wrong turn started World War I is ultimately a story about the fragility of peace and the dangers of accumulated tensions. It demonstrates how systems of alliances meant to provide security can instead create rigidity and escalation. It shows how nationalism, when taken to extremes, can justify violence and destruction in the name of abstract ideals. It reveals how failures of communication, whether between a Czech driver and an Austrian general or between European powers unable to find diplomatic solutions, can have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. It reminds us that history is made not only by great forces and sweeping movements, but also by individual decisions, random chances, and small errors that compound into catastrophe. Franz Ferdinand, had he lived and eventually ascended to the Austro-Hungarian throne, might have implemented reforms that addressed some of the empire's ethnic tensions. He had been known to favor a restructuring that would grant greater autonomy to Slavic populations within the empire, a vision of federalism that might have reduced nationalist pressures for independence. Whether such reforms could have succeeded or would have merely postponed the empire's inevitable dissolution remains unknowable. What is certain is that his death removed whatever possibility existed for peaceful evolution of the Habsburg domains. Instead, his assassination became the justification for policies of aggression and domination that accelerated the empire's destruction.